listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. The fire attack on a Jewish synagogue in Melbourne has intensified a battle between our politicians over the meaning of anti-Semitism and who is responsible for encouraging it.
We barely had time to take stock and grieve and, figure out what this means for Jewish people before politicians and other people started trying to capitalise on this moment to spread their own political message.
From our point of view, from a Jewish community's point of view, there's nothing political about what's happened. We view it solely in terms of our rights and freedoms in this country.
This conversation is one that a lot of us are struggling to talk about without fears of being insensitive to the Jewish community and of those who protest the violence occurring daily in Gaza. So this morning on The Briefing, a special two-part episode with two leaders in the Jewish community sitting on very different sides of this debate. First, though, it is time for the headlines with Antoinette Lattouf. It's Wednesday, December 11.
Hey, Sasha. G'day, everyone. Anthony Albanese will make an election pitch to families today as murmurs mount that we can expect the election to be called soon. So in a speech today, the PM will march on with Labor's plan for universal childcare by scrapping the activity test for subsidies. So that test currently determines the level of childcare subsidies parents get, and it's based on the number of hours they work in a fortnight and, crucially, how much they earn. But if he's re-elected, Albanese promises to remove that and allow families earning less than $530,000 a year access to the assistance for 3 days a week. And how do I know this? Well, the PM has released excerpts of his speech, and his selling point is that his party will be the one to deliver a more equitable future. Yeah, so the December polls have the coalition currently leading Labor 51.8% to 48.2% on a two-party preferred basis. And it's interesting with those numbers, I don't think they'd reflect what has been going on for the last few days, which has been quite tumultuous for the PM as he faces criticism and even calls to resign from some members of the Jewish community. And this is in response to how he has handled the arson attack on the Adass Israel synagogue in Ripponlea. And yesterday he visited the site. He did receive a warm welcome from faith leaders who were happy to welcome him and took him through the building. But he was heckled by members of the public as he left.
The Prime Minister condemned calls for intifada against Jews. For us, mate. What are you doing for us?
So in today's Deep Dive, as we heard at the top of the show, we do talk about how this issue is becoming politicised, Antoinette, and that comes up after the headlines. There is a second part as well that will drop in the feed straight afterwards. And I know you have very strong feelings about this.
Yeah, look, I think despite what many Murdoch newspaper headlines are doing in unison about, whether Albanese should have played tennis or not after the arson attack, and I think it's important to also point out that there was a school bus, an Islamic college school bus in Adelaide, which was torched. Both acts are hideous and don't have a place in Australia. I don't think that is in any way in dispute. But we're yet to see the PM make a comment about that or pledge money to the community, and there aren't front pages of tabloid papers dedicated to that. I think we also need to remember that most voters really care about the cost of living. And we saw yesterday that the RBA left rates on hold again. The other thing that's different to what I think has been a Murdoch playbook in previous elections, millennials now have the same voting bloc power as boomers. And the way we consume our news and who we trust as sources is very different. And in recent elections, we're finding that political campaigns by Murdoch no longer have the same sort of influence that it once did. So I want to stick to the economy because there are growing questions about whether the Reserve Bank is leaving it too late to start cutting rates. The same was said when they were too slow to raise them. So I understand that everybody has very strong opinions about interest rates. But I suspect generationally people see the coverage differently and the so-called, this is terrible for the Prime Minister going into the election. I think there's a bit more scepticism and understanding of broader issues.
And I certainly hope so. We talked in the headlines yesterday about how this issue is becoming politicised. And again, it's part of what forms our deep dive conversation today. But unfortunately, I think we're seeing Australian politics kind of devolve into culture wars. And I don't think the average person wants to see that. But I know that for some people, it's easy to get swept up in. So it is, I think, disappointing. We should be focusing on policies, not politics. Over to the Middle East now, where Syria's newly appointed caretaker Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir has met with members of the country's former government to aid a transition in power. Bashir, whose appointment will run until March next year, says the meetings will continue over the coming months until they're able to establish a constitutional system and effectively reset government institutions to, quote, serve the Syrian people. So who is he? Well, he's not exactly well known across most of Syria, but up until now was the head of a de facto government in a pocket of the country's northwest that was controlled by the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
So that was the group that led the coalition of rebel fighters to the country's capital, Damascus, over the weekend, bringing to an end more than half a century of the Assad's family's brutal dictatorship rule. So Bashir is an engineering graduate. He's in his 40s. He also has qualifications in administrative planning and project management. We can see that he also studied English at university and Sharia law. A couple of years ago, he did step away from engineering to focus on the rebel group. He'll now lead the government, presiding over a country that is trying to, I guess, recover and reform its identity after almost 14 years of dictatorship rule. But I dare say that is quite the meteoric political rise, Sasha. Staying in the Middle East, just quickly, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has taken to the witness stand. If you're wondering what for, no, it's not the ICC trial. It is the long-running corruption trial. And he spent around 4.5 hours on the stand in Tel Aviv. To quickly get you up to speed, he was indicted in 2019 on 3 cases involving gifts from millionaire friends and for allegedly seeking regulatory favours for media tycoons in return for favourable news coverage. Bibi denies any wrongdoing. He's pled not guilty to the charges of bribery, fraud and breach of public trust. So the 75-year-old is Israel's longest-serving PM and the first sitting Prime Minister to be charged with a crime. What's next? Well, the judge ruled that he must testify 3 times a week, and the trial is scheduled to last for several months.
You may remember the outage Telstra had in March this year. It lasted 90 minutes and it meant no calls could be made, not even 000, which impacted people facing emergencies. Now, the telco behemoth has been fined $3 million after failing to transfer people to police, firefighters and paramedics during the outage at its emergency call centre. So it was whacked with the fine for 473 breaches of its obligations as the national operator of the emergency service, and this came after an investigation by the Australian Communications and Media Authority.
Yeah, look, and to be fair, Sasha, there were contingency plans initiated when the outage struck in the early hours of March 1st, and Telstra did transfer 000 calls to a list of backup phone numbers, but 127 calls weren't transferred to emergency services because several numbers on the list were wrong. The telco has apologised, a spokesman saying the company let people down and acknowledged there had been unacceptable failures. And one of those failures was in Melbourne. There was at least one person who went into cardiac arrest and the family couldn't call an ambulance, and that person unfortunately died.
Yeah, and of course we recently saw as well Optus cop a massive $12 million fine over its outage last year, and that's all thousands of its customers unable to call 000. So something the ACMA is really cracking down on. And 2 new sounds have been added to the Australian Sound Archive for 2024. Now, this is an annual capsule put together by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia, and it aims to immortalise iconic songs, jingles, moments, memes, speeches, and even the sounds of nature. So included in the list this year is this unforgettable VB ad, which first started rolling out in 1967.
A hard-earned thirst needs a big cold beer. And the best cold beer is Vic. Victoria Bitter.
I do love the jingle. I don't love the beer. Also making the cut is the original Doctor Who theme song from the 60s, which was actually written, if you didn't know, by an Aussie. Tina Arena's chains and Senator Nova Peris's inaugural speech to Parliament in 2013 were also added to the archive in 2024.
Some of my favourites I took the opportunity to have a little quick look through with the 5 minutes I had. Toot Toot Chugga Chugga Big Red Car.
Iconic.
By the Wiggles.
Chugga chugga big red car.
Also, the grunting of a male koala, which is quite an iconic sound if you've ever heard it. It's terrifying.
Okay.
And one of my personal favourites, Julia Gillard's misogyny speech. That was added back in 2022.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
Some fun little sounds. But yeah, I quite like what the National Film and Sound Archive does with this. Sometimes if I'm looking for historical sounds, I'll go into the archive because they've usually got it. They've got heaps of random bits and pieces, but all of them had some role in helping shape Australia.
I'm just waiting for when like a TikTok song or something makes it in there. Like, I don't know who wrote the I'm looking for a man in finance.
Oh, God. She was American.
Oh, she was American. But like, there's got to be an Aussie equivalent.
There will be
I have
somewhere.
not seen a TikTok or social media moment make the archives. And I reckon if a male koala grunting can make it, so can something that somebody did in their bedroom.
Look,
TikTok.
It's only a matter of time, Antoinette. We won't have to wait too long, I'm sure. Thank you so much for being here for the headlines today. Next up, we are getting into our conversation about how we should be talking about anti-Semitism as the issue, unfortunately, becomes politicised.
Hey, Bension here. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese visited the burnt-out wreckage of the Adass Israel synagogue in Melbourne yesterday after what police described as a terrorist attack on the Jewish house of worship last week. Police are investigating and at the time of recording are yet to comment on the motive behind the attack. There is pretty universal agreement across the board, though, that anti-Semitism, from poorly informed commentary all the way up to extreme violence like this, has become appallingly frequent in Australia. So who or what is responsible for that? Can and should the Australian government be doing more? And what do we count as anti-Semitic in this country? And how should we talk about it? This morning, we're bringing you a two-part special episode of The Briefing, speaking with two Australian Jewish leaders who answer these questions quite differently. We encourage you to hit play on part 2 with Alex Rivchin from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry after this. First, Sarah Schwartz is a human rights lawyer and executive officer at the Jewish Council of Australia. Sarah, welcome to The Briefing. Has this fire attack on this synagogue in Melbourne been over-politicised?
The short answer is yes. I think, I feel like we barely had time to take stock and grieve and, figure out what this means for Jewish people before politicians and other people started trying to capitalise on this moment to spread their own political message. That is from Peter Dutton making comments linking this to Australia's commitments to international law at the United Nations, making comments about Josh Burns, which I thought were really despicable and disgusting, and making comments about refugees and migrants that, is to me and to so many of us so appalling that he would use the Jewish community in that way when, so many of us come from backgrounds where we've immigrated to Australia, and so many of our ancestors also faced racism when they arrived in Australia. And so for him to be using the Jewish community in that way, I think is particularly offensive. But even now, when looking at various different government responses, suggesting that this is linked to protest somehow, and it's, this was not an act of protest. This is a criminal offence and a really despicable racist act. And so, I think we've seen an attempt to politicise this from a lot of different people, and before we even have any knowledge of who the suspects are, what their motivations were. We just have so little knowledge at this stage, and it's already being pounced on.
We know that there's been a lot of anti-Semitism in Australia over the past year. A lot of people conflate what happens in Israel with Jewish people in general. Who or what do you think is the biggest driver of anti-Semitism here?
We've certainly seen a rise in anti-Semitism, and I think this synagogue attack is, a really, really scary indication of that. I think it touches almost every Jewish person because we all have, attended synagogues. These are our places of worship. It feels like an attack on the entire Jewish community. We know that there is an increase in far-right activity and far-right extremism. We've seen increased organising from far-right groups and neo-Nazis and fascist groups, particularly in Victoria. We also know that at times when Israel's violence against Palestinians increases, that can also lead to increased anti-Semitism involving Jewish people.
If it's the case that Israel's actions in Gaza are contributing in some way to the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, is it so wrong for someone like Peter Dutton to argue that Australia opposing Israel in the United Nations in some way is having the opposite effect or increasing anti-Semitism because people who associate Israel and Jewish people generally see that as some kind of permission structure to be anti-Semitic?
I think that it's the exact opposite, and I can explain that. And I just want to foreground this by also saying that, we have no indication that about the synagogue arson attack that it is in any way connected to Israel. And I just want to make that clear that I really don't want to prejudice that sort of ongoing police investigation that's taking place. And I think that it would be, it would be wise for our politicians to also do the same and not prejudice that investigation by assuming it has anything to do with Israel. But, in terms of Peter Dutton's comments, he's done the opposite in that what he is basically saying is because Australia is treating Israel with the same level of international accountability that it would treat any foreign government, that somehow is an attack on the Jewish community. And in doing so, he is making that conflation between Jewish people and support for the state of Israel. As we say often at the Jewish Council, there are many Jewish people, including us, who disagree with the actions of the Israeli state, particularly in this moment. I think we're seeing a real groundswell and a real growing number of Jewish people, both in Australia and around the world, who are seeing what Israel is doing, seeing the atrocities that Israel is committing in Gaza and saying, not in my name, I don't support this. They're questioning their previously held connections to Israel, to support for Israel, because we're seeing the horrors come in, every day on our screens. Only a few days ago, Amnesty International released a 300-page report finding that Israel has been committing and is committing the crime of all crimes, that of genocide. One of the things that increases anti-Semitism is the fact that Netanyahu and the Israeli government frequently make statements that these atrocities are not only committed in the name of Israelis, but they're committed in the name of all Jewish people, that these actions are done to keep all Jewish people, including myself, in the diaspora safe. And in doing so, they really implicate all of us in Israel's atrocities and crimes, and then promote this idea that we are all responsible for what the state of Israel does. And I think that is something that increases anti-Semitism. And so I also think Peter Dutton, it's very clear, and it should be very clear to everyone, that he doesn't actually care about Jewish people. He's willing to target a Jewish Labor MP who has been making many statements about anti-Semitism, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But regardless, the fact that he's willing to go after a Jewish MP, the fact that his party was willing to go after us, Jewish people who gave evidence to a Senate inquiry on anti-Semitism, because we're not speaking about anti-Semitism and our own personal experiences in the exact way that he wants us to, which is just about unconditional support for Israel. I think it shows that he's willing to use Jews as political pawns in the game that he's trying to play. And I think that increases racism against Jewish people.
Should there be an exclusion zone around places of worship for protests? And also, do you believe that Australia's government is doing enough to stamp out anti-Semitism?
I don't think that the Australian government is doing enough to stamp out racism in general, and that includes anti-Semitism. I think in times like this, there's often this focus on sort of law and order politics and We need to, create more criminal offences. We need to ban certain activities, which I just think is the wrong framework, and there's no evidence to show that any of that would have affected this particular incident. It's hard to see how, adding more criminal offences or bans is going to do anything to address incidents like these.
Are there specific things the government could do, do you think, that they're not doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first step is the government needs to not take a reactionary approach to this, and they need to not politicise this moment. They need to take a considered approach and consult widely with Jewish people, with other racialised groups. I think that the government should really be supporting efforts on the ground, anti-racism efforts between different community groups to develop strong anti-racism strategies. And I think the government could be doing things like addressing the spread of online racial hatred, which we are certainly seeing at the Jewish Council, an increase in online racism, which we know can spread to acts of racism in real life and spread to the rise of extremism and extremist racist thought. And I think that there's a real need for increasing of civil penalties, but other ways to crack down on online hate speech, not necessarily through a criminal justice response, but through a response that actually focuses on how do we address this language on the internet that is spreading. And I think the government could also do things like getting behind the Australian Human Rights Commission anti-racism framework that is being developed. These frameworks that are being developed across different racialised groups, including with the Jewish community, that are already being developed and could back those sorts of initiatives. And I think those initiatives are really important to combating racism.
Many non-Jewish Australians, and I would say Jewish Australians, being Jewish myself, would say that this subject is so difficult to speak about. Whatever you say about it, it feels like there has to be 1,000 caveats about, but of course we don't support October 7, but of course we don't support the killing of children, but of course we don't support the firebombing of a synagogue, etc., etc. What advice would you give to people trying to talk about this issue sensibly and with humanity?
I would love to get some advice on that myself. Like, we get that all the time, when we try to speak about what is happening in Gaza. And I think there's a lot of people in this moment who feel like, their voices aren't being heard. I would say it's important for all of us to try to understand, the silencing efforts that are taking place at the moment, the way particularly Palestinian people have been silenced in this moment and their voices aren't being prioritised. I'm just thinking about, the way that so many Palestinian people, when they're speaking about these issues, about the atrocities being committed against their families, are forced to answer questions about whether they condemn October 7th or Hamas. And any condemnation is never seen as enough. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that people should be able to speak about the atrocities that are being committed without qualification and without having to address other people's sensibilities. I also think that there is a real need for education all around. So many Jewish people like myself and others, grew up in an environment where we really did I can't speak for you, but for myself, I grew up in an environment where I, did think for a long time that Jewish identity was inextricably linked to Israel. I don't think that anymore. And I have, a strong Jewish identity that is unconnected to support for Israel and is connected to Jewish values of social justice. But that came about through processes of speaking with people, through learning and education and having those interpersonal relationships, and people sort of holding my hand and taking me through. These conversations are impossible and really hard to have in the midst of what so many and what I think is an ongoing genocide. I don't think it's the responsibility of Palestinians and their advocates to, hold the hands of Jewish people who are coming into this topic for the first time. I don't think politicians should be, making laws and policies to address people's individuals' sensibilities and understanding and education. That sort of needs to come at a ground level and at a community level.
Is the answer to this that people who don't know what they're talking about should just not talk about it? Or should people go out there and risk sounding ill-informed or risk saying something that might sound to someone else's ears awful in order to figure out how they think about this issue?
I think the answer is never to stay silent. When people feel like they can't speak about an issue, or when people feel like they are being silenced, then it means that we're not learning, and it means it increases polarization. It means it's impossible to have conversations across the line. I think that we need to have really clear boundaries in terms of understanding, absolutely, we can't speak about this issue in a way that is racist or discriminatory to certain groups. We should all be able to speak about what we see as human rights abuses occurring without understanding, without knowledge of every single peace agreement that, every single negotiation and historical fact about Israel and Palestine. We should be able to see what's happening in front of us and call it out as an atrocity and call it out for what it is. People should be able to see, rising acts of anti-Semitism and call that out. But also it's really important to have those conversations with people around you. And yeah, that's probably, the best way to learn and to grow is to have conversations with people around us.
Sarah Schwartz, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Human rights lawyer and executive officer at the Jewish Council of Australia, Sarah Schwartz there. And this is part one of our special two-part episode on anti-Semitism. We encourage you to hit play on part two with Alex Rivchin from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry after this. Thanks for listening. That's it for now. Before you go, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might get something out of it. And you can always check us out on our socials at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram and Listener Newsroom on TikTok and YouTube. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.